This is the one that counts, I guess. I'll put it there. I just want everyone to hear me. There's so many of you. Where did you all come from? It's wonderful to be back at Powell's. This is one of my super favorite bookstores in the whole United States. I love this bookstore. I like the people it attracts. There we go. So thanks to Renee, and thanks to Powell's, and thanks to all of you. Terrific, progressive, compassionate, good people in Portland and wherever we are. And I guess I ought to thank about 10 people I can see who showed up last night when I spoke at Lewis and Clark, who must be absolute masochists. I feel it twice. People tell me that my new book, I hope you don't be hurt if my back is to you, because I always aim at the microphone for some reason. So all the powers of evil are right down there. People tell me my new book, Letters to a Young Teacher, is the first really happy book I've ever written. And I know why they say that. It's because it's written as an invitation to a beautiful profession. That's how I think of it, you know? It's a year of letters. Is that buzzing too much, or is it okay? I don't want to be a bumblebee, you know? It's a year of letters that's based on my conversations with a wonderful, incandescent, high-spirited young teacher, Michael Francesca, who came to teach first grade in an inner-city school in Boston, public school, all-black school, in almost exactly the same neighborhood where I started out in a similarly all-black school 40 years before. And she wrote me a letter, as lots of teachers do, and said, would you like to come and visit with my children? And I said, I'd love to come. And she said, you need directions? And I said, nope. I know where you are. And like many teachers, as soon as I got there, she put me to work. Because they always tease me. They say, you know, they say, you write the books, let's see if you can still do it. And she was merciless with me when I made a mistake, because I did, you know, I messed up her lessons repeatedly. One of the first times I visited, she asked me if I would give the children, the little 6-year-olds, a short sentence of nonfiction. I didn't pay attention. And I gave them a big sentence about animals who talk. She said that was fiction. I talk a lot with my dog, Sweetie Pie. She's passed away since, but I used to talk with her all the time, golden retriever. And she gave me very cogent answers, I thought. I once suggested on Capitol Hill that golden retrievers ought to be allowed to serve in Congress, because that would make them more humane. Anyway, I gave her this long sentence about talking animals, and she immediately scolded me with kind of stern, too, but with that delicious sense of humor that first grade teachers often have. She said to the children, she right in front of the children, she said, Mr. Jonathan has not listened carefully. We all know about listening skills. And her children called me Mr. Jonathan because my last name's hard to pronounce. And sometimes they couldn't pronounce the TH, so they'd say, Mr. Jonathan. And she picked it up, and she said, Mr. Jonathan has not behaved like a grown-up. And she asked them how I should be punished. And they voted that I needed a timeout and that I had to go and sit on the reading rug in the corner. And one little boy named Reginald, whom I got to like so much, felt bad for me. And he really felt sad for me because I did feel embarrassed. And when she wasn't looking, he snuck over and he put a decal of a big green frog on my forehead. I got to love that classroom, and I kept visiting, for almost an entire year, and watched that beautiful chemistry of love and trust gradually evolve between the children and their teacher. It's one of those miracles, one of those beautiful things, When they come to you in September, they're little strangers, and in June, you stand there in the door and you say goodbye, and you cry. You don't want to say goodbye. You don't get any of that, and you don't get any sense of that beautiful part of the profession in all the stuff that's coming down from Washington nowadays. You ever heard of this law called No Child Left Happy or Healthy? No teacher left passionate and joyful. And I called her Francesca. In my book, I had to disguise her. She was very beautifully educated, as probably all of you are, which is why you came to see me tonight. She was certified as a teacher, but she also loved poetry and literature. And she'd been reading, some of you older folks will appreciate this, she'd been reading authors like Paul Goodman. How many remember that name? Since she was 14 years old. And she absolutely refused to drill her children for exams. She wouldn't do any of that drill and kill stuff in order to raise the AYP, as it's called. Do they use that term in the state? She refused to do that. She wouldn't play any tricks to artificially inflate their scores, and filled the room instead with her own contagious sense of jubilation, being in the company of children, and with the exhilaration that the kids brought with them into class. And she did work hard. She wasn't one of these, kind of hippie teachers who just says, oh, they're beautiful, they'll learn organically. I call them the wheat germ teachers. When they sense their own organic need to read, they'll let us know. You're gonna wait a long time. I swear I never felt an organic need to learn quadratic equations. Now she wasn't like that. She had her head very well screwed on. And she worked hard, and she taught phonics. Yes. How many know what that is? She taught phonics, even though she was a rebel spirit. And a lot of progressive teachers, most of them, teach phonics. We're not scared of phonics. People in Washington, these right-wing people who are setting policy now, they assume that if you're a nice person who likes children, you probably don't teach phonics, or that you're afraid of phonics. And I'm not scared of phonics. I've taught it. I'm not frightened of consonant blend. If I ever meet one, I might invite him out to supper, you know? But there are people in Washington at these right-wing think tanks that are dictating policy now. They're the ones who really wrote NCLB. That who honestly, their addiction to phonics is bizarre. It's as if they think this is the answer to every affliction that womankind has ever suffered, as though this could cure cancer, you know? And let's face it, there are a lot of lunatics in the phonics movement. And I know one of them who lives in Arizona, in Phoenix. And whenever I go to speak anywhere in Arizona, she follows me around. And she says she likes me. A lot of strange people like me. And she always sits in the front row, and no matter what I'm talking about. Once I was talking about low-income housing construction for homeless families in Tucson. No matter what the subject, she comes up at the end, she grabs me by the elbow, affectionately, leans forward, whispers in my ear, phonics. Oh, you didn't emphasize phonics enough tonight, you know. And she sends me all these funny phonics systems she's developed, or those she comes upon, color-coded phonics systems. They're so complicated. You could never teach them. I mean, it would be more work than it was worth. And I gave up writing to her after a while, because you can't encourage people like that. She'd show up at my back door someday. But then she wrote to my assistant. My assistant calls her the phonetic fanatic from Phoenix. Now, you know, Francesca, like most good teachers, and I'm going to point out there are thousands like her, she taught all the skills and the sounds, but she refused to do it from one of those little pit-pat phonics books. You know the sort of thing I mean? Have any of you ever seen these, they're called like direct instruction, or there's one horrible one called SFA. How many of you have ever seen that? Success for All, it's called. Not a very modest title, is it? Success for All. It's usually a failure. It's not very good. At least they called it like a little more success for a few. That wouldn't sell. And it's, you know, it's got these boring little booklets that you give children. Each little booklet just hammers some sound into their head. Do you know what I mean? So there'll be one little booklet that's, I remember one horrendous one called, you know, and you're trying to get little kids excited about literature. 6-year-olds. This book is called Sad Sam, because that's the sound, right? And there's a sentence, the only sentence in it really is, Sad Sam sat on the sand. And then you have to ask children to predict what's going to happen next. What are they going to predict? There's no plot. Well, I've heard little kids say, he keeps sitting there. He gets sand in his eyes. She wouldn't use any of that stuff because she knew what good literature was, and she loved it. So she taught them phonics out of the words that they brought into the classroom and those stories that children insist on telling us every morning the minute they walk into class. And out of poetry and good literature with which she flooded her sun-filled corner classroom. Multicultural books, because all her kids were black, so you can bet she had the whole Harlem Renaissance in that classroom. But also just classics that she loved. William Butler Yeats, early lyrical poems of Yeats are wonderful with little children. And she read them the German poet Rilke. There's a sonnet called On Autumn. Children loved it. And of course, they weren't reading Rilke, you know, but they would pick a word or a mood or an idea out of one of these beautiful poems. And then they would want to know how to spell it. And then, you know, back to their desks for a little hard work to figure it out. And of course, like all first graders, they stubbornly refused to use vowels for a whole half year. It was all consonants. Have you ever noticed that? Most first graders they just don't vote for vowels for quite a while. Even when they know them, they won't use them. They're resistant little creatures, you know? So that you get these wonderful pages of words that are all like K, L, D, T, B, Z, and I'm not practiced, so I'd say, what is that? And she'd say, oh, that's easy, that's kindergarten, or, you know, that's lickety-split or something. You know, teachers get to decode this. Very good. And she gave them all the classics that probably most of you grew up with, like, one of my favorite books in the world by Eric Carle. It's called The Very, 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 Very Hungry Caterpillar. How many of you know that? And The Grouchy Ladybug. That's a good one, too. And Eric Carle called me up, by the way, a few months ago when he saw the proofs of my book, because there's a lot of caterpillars in my book. And I guess one caterpillar likes another. And I remember the day he called me, because I almost never answer my telephone when I'm working. A lot of, you know, it could have been the phonetic. You know, but a little voice said to me, Jonathan, answer the phone this time. It will be worth it. God wants you to pick up the phone. So I did. And it was Eric Carle. I was so happy. I don't mean to be boastful, but that meant more to me, I can assure you, than a call from the White House. Any White House. Unless there's Abe Lincoln or somebody, FDR. And they're not likely to call, unfortunately. I was so happy that he called me. And I kept thinking his voice would be very fuzzy, you know. It wasn't. I told him, I said, you don't sound like a caterpillar. So he invited me to come out and visit him. I'm looking forward to that. And in the end, her kids did well on their exams. And, you know, maybe that tells us something about the difference between learning out of terror and anxiety and learning out of joy. There are people who will tell you that black kids, black inner city kids, are so different from everybody else in America and learn so differently and have such unique needs that you have to teach them by a unique curriculum. Have you ever heard that? Oh yes, there are these experts in, it's known as the effective schools people. You ever heard that term? This started long ago. It's never worked. You know, they say these black kids are different, so they need to be drilled uniformly with, you know, on a straight line to the destination of the next high-stakes exam. You know, and they don't have time for curiosity and merriment and caterpillars. Let the suburban kids enjoy all the beauty of the earth, all the treasures of the world. Drill these black kids to be obedient and predictable and useful. You understand? It's a utilitarian agenda for those kids. And Francesca just refused this. She said to me, I refused to treat my babies as if they were a different species from the mainstream of America. She said, give them the same good opportunities that you and I received, and they will blossom like the flowers that they are. and her babies did blossom because she adored them and they loved her. And a lot of these urban schools, you'll find something else. A lot of these inner city segregated schools, they're flooded now with business-oriented language. Again, it's highly utilitarian. It's like, what economic uses will they have for us when they grow up? One businessman in New York who thought he was being liberal and compassionate said to me, he'd read one of my books, I think it was the last one, The Shame of the Nation, and he said, Jonathan, I was really upset when I read this book. I wrote about a little girl named Pineapple. Do any of you remember her? She's an adorable little girl who used to boss me around. Little pushy little girl. I love kids like that. Plump and bossy. And she's the one who told me once, when she was in 3rd grade, that she didn't like this suit I wore. See this black suit? She's, because I always wore it every time she saw me. And she said once, very sweetly, she said, Jonathan, is that the only suit you can afford? And I said, no, I have 2 suits. She said, let me see the other one someday. So and then I wore the other one, which was identical. You see? She sat me down like a little guidance counselor and said, Jonathan, someday when you're in Manhattan, I want you to go to a good store and buy a new suit, a nice respectable suit. And so I did that. She intimidated me to the point where I went to Brooks Brothers and I bought a brand new suit, cost $300. That was a couple of years ago. And I came back, but the trouble from her point of view was the same black suit again. So she sits me down and she says, she was in 5th grade by now and she was mature enough to get the point. What a lovely child. And she said to me, Jonathan, I know you get upset sometimes to see the way we have to live, but you don't always need to dress in black. People used to say to me, you know, who didn't understand, you'll hear this too if you live the kind of life I do. They'd say, gee, it's nice of you, Jonathan, that you like to go up and be with those kinds of children, that you go up to the Bronx all the time, the South Bronx, New York, or you go to the south side of Chicago or so forth. And you like to be with those kids. It's nice of you. And it's as though they think I'm doing the kids a favor, as though I had this big bag of colonial blessings that I collected in Harvard Square, and I'm going to go and sprinkle them on the foreheads of the poor. And it's never seemed like that to me at all. I have never felt that I was bringing blessings to those children. I have always gone there in search of blessings. And in these little ones like Pineapple, whose spirits are high and compassion so strong, despite all they suffer, I feel I find those blessings every single time. Every single time. And Francesca felt it too, and that's why she loved her job. But she hated these business slogans on the wall. This businessman in New York that I told her about, that she ran into this in Boston, said to me once, Jonathan, I'm on your side. He said, when I read about little Pineapple, I thought, if she can't be trained to fill the jobs I have available, then I have no one to hire. He thought he was on my side, just like the phonics lady, you see? And I got mad at him. What a nerve he had to say, little Pineapple. I said to him, listen, if you need to train people for your entry-level jobs, train your own daughter or your own son. Educate Pineapple so she can buy you out someday. Or turn her back on your whole mercantile experience. And don't they be mad? And, you know, but this is going on everywhere. That you'll see it in LA, you'll see it in Chicago, you probably see it in parts of Portland too, even as progressive as the city is, you'll see these business slogans in inner city schools. You never see them in the top suburbs. And it's all about, America's competitive edge, beating the Japanese or something. It's always, I saw one in a city I won't name because I don't want to embarrass them. Well, actually, I do. It was Columbus, Ohio. And I saw a sign in an all-black school that said, in kindergarten, that said that the mission, you know what mission statements are? It said the mission of the school was to develop products. Products that would, that means children, products that would sharpen America's competitive edge in the global marketplace. In kindergarten. So I told Francesca that, and she said, why should little 6-year-olds give a damn about the global marketplace? She said, they care about belly buttons, itchy elbows. I refuse, she said, to steal away their childhood. God bless young teachers who have that kind of nerve. Well, there are hundreds of thousands of teachers like Francesca all over America. And I meet them everywhere. Or else they're in universities and they're ready to come into teaching. And they want to teach in the inner city schools or in reservation schools or poor rural schools. But particularly in the inner city schools where Black and Latino kids are and poor Asian kids. Hmong and Cambodian kids, for example, are treated exactly the way Black kids used to be treated. And they want to teach these kids. And they have almost a preferential option for the poor, to use a religious term. But 50% of them quit in urban schools within 3 years. And when I ask them why they're growing demoralized, why they're thinking of quitting, they never say it's because the kids are too hard. They never blame the parents. They never blame the neighborhoods. They always tell me the same thing nowadays. They say it's this terrible anxiety that you feel in these schools nowadays because of this horrible law, No Child Left Behind. It's this testing mania that's being forced down the throats of our children. They tell me they hate this law. I mean, I can tell you, if I had 1,000 teachers here and you just wanted, you were just in a mood to hear people hiss, you'd just say NCLB, I swear. And these aren't, thank you. And these aren't teachers who are afraid of being held accountable for doing well. No good teacher is afraid of that, but they want to be held accountable for the right things. Do you understand? And they don't need Mr. Bush to tell them, he said when he was promoting NCLB that this was because our teachers need to learn to strive for excellence and have high expectations. He used those terms. And he was very abusive of teachers. He said they're not striving for excellence. And Francesca was cuttingly sarcastic. She said, thank you, Mr. President. Excellence. I never thought of that before. I thought I worked all these years to come into these schools in order to strive for mediocrity. They said high expectations. Wow, what a radical idea. It's so insulting. These semi-literate politicians telling us we should be striving for high expectations. And the teachers tell me that in a lot of these schools they have to spend half the school year really in one way or another getting the kids ready for exams. It's not true in the best suburbs because they know their kids are going to do well anyway. So they don't like it. No principal likes this law. They all hate it. But it's just an irritant in the top suburbs. It's only in the inner city schools that it changes everything. And the worst of it is that these tests are useless to teachers because How many of you know that? How many of you are in schools where you give the exams around March maybe, and when do you get the results back? Summertime. That's right. You passed the test. That's right. I'm going to give a standardized exam at the end of the year, so get ready. I'll give you number 2 pencils. Sorry. They always used to break. You know? Those darn number 2 pencils. Mr. Bush, when he was selling this to Congress, said all we want to do is help this young, lovely young teacher, Miss Francesca, or whoever you are, to identify where little Peter's or Shaniqua's weaknesses lie so she can pinpoint those weaknesses and help little Shaniqua. Well, I don't know what planet Mr. Bush lives on. Probably that little one they recently voted out. It's not a planet. But the tests are given usually in February and March. The results never come back before July, August. Last year, New York's tests from March came back following October. So what's Miss Francesca supposed to do? Send a postcard to Shaniqua? You know, and say, dear Shaniqua, if I knew last winter what I know now, I would have done more work with you on consonant plans. You know, so you would have been promoted. So the tests of no value to the teachers. They were purely punitive. They placed an ex post facto label of success or failure on the child, or the school, or the teacher. And frankly, in my belief, that was the intention all along. I don't believe, sincerely speaking out of my heart, I'm not speaking about every member of Congress, but certainly those who designed this law, I don't believe they ever intended all this testing stuff to improve the quality of education in America. I think they intended it as a shaming ritual to hold up the entire idea of the public sector, of public education, to national ridicule in order to soften up the ground, for privatizing schemes like vouchers. That's my belief. And even worse is the effect on curriculum. The teachers can't listen to their children because they're under a time clock now in the really test-driven schools. And I met a woman like this yesterday in Portland, a principal, a really nice woman, who told me, I'm under that threat always. They're gonna, if I can't pump the scores, they'll take my school away, and they'll ultimately, one of the series of federal punishments is to hand it over to a private corporation to run it. So a big opening wedge for vouchers. And so as a result, the teachers are afraid to let a kid ramble in an interesting way. So, let's say you're there and you're trying to teach the skill you're supposed to teach that's going to be on the test so you can raise the school's AYP, and some little child insists on interrupting you, and raises his hand. I'm thinking of a particular little boy, and he asks you a question. Well, here's how it usually works. You've written on the board an outcome that you're supposed to teach that's aligned with the exams. That's their favorite word, aligned with the exam. And you're trying to do it. And he raises his hand, and little 6-year-olds are like geniuses at subverting lesson plans. I always say that's an entitlement God gave them to mess up all of the work we did on Sunday night, preparing for the week. And he says, teacher, guess what? And kids never tell you anything. You have to guess. They always say to me, guess what? And so she has to say, what? And he says, yesterday, and she's still thinking he's going to help me with this outcome, And he says, yesterday, my uncle took me to the zoo, and guess what? And now she's trapped. You have to say what? There's a rule. You have to say what. And she says, what? And he says, and I saw a baby bear that was just born. And off he goes to tell her about the baby bear. And he starts piling on the ands and butts for one of those delectable run-on sentences at which little kids are almost as good as William Faulkner. And if you listen, at the end of all those ands and buts, there's usually a piece of hidden treasure where the child unveils something about his soul that you never knew before. And good teachers use that hidden treasure as the key to unlock that child's motivation. But in these test-driven inner-city schools, the teacher never gets to see that inner gift, that secret, and never gets to know that motivation. Francesca refused to silence her children. She revered, as I did, the gift that I think the greatest educator of the last 50 years left us. I'm sure you all know who I mean. Mr. Rogers, yes, somebody whispered. Fred Rogers. He certainly influenced me more than any other educator of our times. I bet you, some of you Marxists thought I was going to say Paulo Freire, didn't you? Admit it. Well, I knew Paulo and I loved him, but Mr. Rogers influenced me more. And just a wonderful soul. I just can't believe he's gone now. And he always talked about listening to children and don't rush them, and Francesca respected that. And as a result, she had to disobey a lot of rules. But she survived, and she didn't quit. And she wasn't fired. And she was good at what she did, so she made herself inexpendable. No one wanted to fire her. And the parents came to trust her. If you're going to teach in a school like that, you want to make good allies. First thing, give all the parents your cell phone number. Let them call you at night. Let them become your friends. Go visit them. They're not going to let anyone fire you once they get to know you and love you and see that you love their children. So in my book, I just pack it with survival strategies. All the things I learned from Francesca and teachers in Seattle and Portland and the Bay Area, all around the country in the past couple of years. Teachers who want to survive within their schools, but also want to survive with souls intact and personalities jubilant and unbroken by this grim Dickensian mood that's come into our schools. So I always recommend to young teachers, if you want to make sure that you can survive and not lose your joyful sense of mischievous delight in pint-sized little people, which is very important. Learn to develop a kind of sly irreverence, just an attitude of sly irreverence. Be mischievous, you know? I think mischief is very, very important skill. Now that isn't, you don't get any points for that under NCLB. I think you should. I think you should get a lot of points for mischievous delight in the act of, in life itself, in childhood, in being a little person, or being a friend to little people. One thing Francesca thought was brutally unfair, and I agree with her. I'm only going to make 2 more points because I want to get to meet a lot of you. I want to meet as many of you as possible. She thought it was really unfair to test the kids in the early grades, like 3rd grade is when you have to under the new federal law. That wasn't a very good sentence, but I used all my good syntax to write my book, so now I don't have any left. And she thought it was brutally unfair to test 3rd graders, and many schools now start earlier, 2nd, 1st grade, kindergarten even, as they say, to get them ready for the bubble tests. She thought this was brutally unfair, so long as she knew, since she grew up in privilege, she knew that the richest kids, when they took these tests, weren't being tested simply on the first 3 or 4 years of school, but they usually had 2 or 3 years of wonderful preschool also. Am I right? Isn't that true even here in Oregon? See? And a lot of them had like Montessori since they were 2 and a half. You ever heard of Montessori? you know, intended for poor children originally. Now usually the luxury of the privileged. And she knew all about that because she grew up not, you know, in one of those areas that I know well, like New York, where the richest people typically send their kids to preschools. There's a certain group of preschools that are considered so essential to getting ahead, to getting you on the track to college when you're 2.5. Believe it or not, they're called the baby Ivies. And they're very expensive. They are all, in New York, they all cost $20,000 and up. There's one I know that costs $24,000 for 2.5-year-olds. Think how little a 2.5-year-old is. You know, it's like, how much is that per pound? And then you get these poor kids in the inner city, typically, who have had no pre-K. Or they're very lucky if they're in the most super progressive state, they might, you know, half of them, a third of them might have had 1 year half-day pre-K, and that's very unusual. And then suddenly they all take the same exam. And I've been battling with Congress about this. I've been telling my friends in Congress, you must not renew this law, this testing law for elementary school children unless you condition it on requiring every state to provide at least 2 years of wonderful developmental pre-K for every low-income child, or else the tests are not testing anything except prior opportunity and the privilege of wealth. I just think, you know, I don't get mad too often, but I just think there's something deeply hypocritical in a society that would hold a little 9-year-old girl in 3rd grade accountable. That's the big word nowadays. Accountable. I hate that word. Accountable. Hold her accountable for her performance on a standardized exam, but doesn't hold the president and Congress accountable for robbing her of what they gave their own kids 7 years before. It is unacceptable. I mean, we all know what little George gets when he's a little baby. I mean, in his case, I'm not sure it worked, but we all know. And the other point I make is this, that in the long run, none of this testing stuff, none of these AYPs, none of these big words like assessment, you know, none of this business-minded measurement mania that's taking over our schools, which, by the way, is not new. Any of you who studied American history know that the same thing happened in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Did you know that? How many know that? Yeah. It was forced on the schools by the corporations that wanted to make sure poor children could be measured and tested sufficiently to know what they'd be worth in the economy. It's the same thing. It's right after Plessy versus Ferguson. And we're now in a similar moment, having our Supreme Court having just reversed Brown versus Board of Ed, so we're right back there. There's nothing new about this. But the people who, you know, none of this stuff, none of this measurement stuff does any good for children. It doesn't, tests do not teach reading. Only well-paid teachers do, and only if they're excited about the job they have, and not just well-paid, but well-rewarded and respected, and if they have a small enough class size so they can really listen to the children, as Mr. Rogers told us, and not have to be classroom cops. Now, I walked into classes in New York City with 38 in a class in 5th grade in September, even though there's some union rule that can't be more than 28. I don't know how they do it, but they always break those rules. And there's 38 in that class. I walked into a high school in Los Angeles, Fremont High. How many of you ever heard of that? South Central. A school has 5,000 kids. I didn't see a white kid the whole day I was there. It's like a monument. It's like a sublime artistic tribute to the glories of apartheid, you know? I hate to be sarcastic, but It looks like a prison. There's so many kids that half of them don't have classrooms. They're in trailers. Trailers. Now you probably know that nobody in America wants to call them trailers because we don't think it's nice to put our kids in trailers, so what do we call them? Portables. Thank you, class. Very good. But in California, they won't even call them portables. They have, you know what they call them? Bungalows. Bungalows. They don't look like bungalows. Bungalows are cute. They're cute little houses with thatched roofs, you know, and Poor and Piglet and Eeyore have a tea party. These are smelly trailers. I walked into a classroom at Fremont High with 40 in the class, okay? And the teacher, whom I know very well to this day, had 6 classes with 40 in each class. And that was typical of that school and of several other high schools in LA. And then I go to the rich schools because I know I grew up in privilege, as many of you did probably. And I see lovely 3rd grades in the suburbs with 16 or maybe 18 in a class. And high school classes with 18 to 20 typically. And labs usually smaller, and AP classes even smaller. And then I know wealthy people who live in the suburbs and don't even send their kids to those schools, but when they're old enough, they send them to prep schools. They typically send them to boarding schools in New England. Did you know a lot of the fancy boarding schools are back east in New England? Exeter, have you ever heard of Exeter? Groton, Andover. Okay, I live right near there, and I know those schools very well. In fact, I live 15 minutes from Exeter and 10 minutes from Andover. Those are considered the top prep schools in America. Exeter's class size is capped at 13. Andover, 12. And not every student who goes to Andover, I can assure you, is the brightest bulb in America. There's a lot of dumb boys get into Andover. I know, because I went to a school like that, and I had lots of dumb boys in my class. They admitted me because I was Jewish. They needed to renew the blood. They had all these ingrown people with first names that were like last names, you know, like Abbott, Cabot, names like that. That's why they admitted Jews to a few of these schools, you know. And I don't mean to be a Jewish chauvinist, but and I've always figured that's the only reason they admitted me, because I didn't fit in any other way. But listen, I don't want to pick on George Bush, but he went to Andover. How many knew that? Andover costs $40,000 a year. When NCLB was being discussed, some of us were saying, don't talk about a testing bill, talk about equalizing resources for these low-income schools. And he said, on the record, he said the problem is not money. They don't need more money. The urban schools are like automobiles whose engines are flooded. Nobody asked how come the engine at Andover isn't flooded with $40,000 a year. You see, why do we let them get away with this hypocrisy? He went to Andover. By the most unusual coincidence, so did his father. Are there any statisticians here, you know, who do probability theory? I mean, that's an extraordinary statistical improbability that when you think how hard it is to get into that school, that 2 generations who happen to have the same name could get into the same school, which I guess proves that intelligence really is hereditary. Huh? How else do you explain it? Listen, I'm not going to pick on him, and I don't want to ramble on any longer or be small-minded, but here's what I believe. If very small class size and the individual attention this enables a wonderful teacher to give to every single child in that class, if this is good for the son of a president, good for the daughter of a big-time business CEO, then it's good for the poorest child of the poorest mother in Chicago, Seattle, or Portland, or LA. That's my belief. Anyway, I'm going to end this. Let me tell you, I want to end by saying the following, that my book is cheerful and happy, and I enjoyed writing it, actually. The first book was fun to write in a long time, but there is an anger in the book, too, and there's a lot of politics in the latter part of the book, encouraging young people and teachers who are young at heart, not just to do their best to survive within these classes and bring joy and beauty into their little children's lives, but also to go out and speak politically as witnesses on behalf of these children, because if you don't do it, who will? You know, you're the best witnesses. I'm speaking to the teachers here. You see it every day, and these little ones can't speak for themselves, and you have to speak for them. And I try to do it. That's why I've been driving all the Democrats in the Senate crazy, because a lot of them have known me for years, and some of them like me. I don't know why, because I annoy them, but they like me, because even though I say it's time for you to act like Democrats, real Democrats, you know, like Paul Wellstone, and Patty Murray from your neighboring state of Seattle, and Tom Harkin from Iowa, those real Democrats who have some loyalty to the dreams for which Dr. King and that whole generation gave their lives, and makes them mad at me. Senator Kennedy's been mad at me for about a month now, because I've been telling him, I don't want you to renew this law, even though he helped co-sponsor it. It was a great political mistake, and I'm begging him to rethink it. And I couldn't get him to reply to me. Do you know that? All the other senators were willing to talk with me about it, and he wouldn't answer me. And he's from my state of Massachusetts, and he's a friend of mine. I know his dog. I played with his dog, and he wouldn't answer me, so I went on a fast. Did you know that?
Yes.
I started early July, a partial fast, or I'd be dead by now. But I went on a fast, and I lost 30 pounds, and when a newspaper reporter in Boston at our local good paper, the Boston Globe, met me and saw how skinny I got, he got worried, and he wrote quite a long, big story about it, and he mentioned that I was very upset with Senator Kennedy. And suddenly, after 3 months, 2 days ago, I was invited by his office to have a conversation with him. And we're going to have a full morning to talk in about 10 days. And I hope I don't lose my nerve. You know, it's hard to speak truth to power. And some people really will attack you if you do it. I have been roughly attacked by the neoconservatives, do you know that term? And the far right wing. And I have to debate on TV. I have to go on TV and debate them, because the little kids I know aren't going to get that chance. So if they ask me to come on CNN or one of these TV shows, I do it. But I don't like it, because these people are really mean. I mean, I don't know. Have you ever seen Fox TV? I mean, these people aren't just mean, they're sociopaths. They're filled with hate. And I always think they must have had miserable childhoods, because why else could they be so mean to everybody else? You know, there's a beautiful line by the poet, my favorite poet, my favorite modern poet, W.H. Auden. How many of you like Auden? You know, I like him because he was so wise about cruelty. And in one of his poems, he said, when will we ever know what all school children learn? Those to whom evil is done, do evil in return. And I often think these vicious people from these far right-wing think tanks must have had terrible childhoods. You know, I want to give every Republican child at least a dachshund, you know. I don't know if they deserve golden retrievers, but something fuzzy and friendly. I mean, these people are mean, and they are good debaters. They use words with surgical efficiency, and I'm not too good at that. They know how to cut right to your heart, and they can make you feel stupid in public, you know? And they, I mean, I see them before we debate, and they don't even chat. Most people, adversaries, chat in the green room in advance. They don't chat. They're going through their index cards, and you know what they're planning to do to you. And they use words like sharpened knives, and they draw blood, and it hurts a lot, because I'm not a tough guy, and I didn't grow up prepared for this. But I don't really care what they do to me now, because I'm too old to bite my tongue. And no matter who I anger with my words, no matter what the price I may be forced to pay, I intend to keep on fighting in this struggle to my dying day. Thank
you. You've been listening to National Book Award-winning author and educator Jonathan Kozol, speaking about his latest work, Letters to a Young Teacher. Jonathan Kozol has been working with children in inner-city schools for over 40 years. His books include Death at an Early Age, Savage Inequalities, and The Shame of the Nation, The Restoration of Apartheid Schooling in America. To find out more about Jonathan Kozol and his work, please visit the pdxjustice Media Productions website at www.pdxjustice.org. You'll find links to Jonathan Kozol's webpage and to groups doing education advocacy and social equality and justice work inspired by the author. This program was produced by PDX Justice Media Productions. Thank you for watching, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access television, net neutrality, and all forms of grassroots, democratic, community media.